Good evening, class. Welcome to Nonprofit Organization Leadership Today. We have a wonderful guest, Dr. Scott Van Beck from Houston A+ Challenge. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for the invite.
Wonderful. Do you want to tell our class a little bit about your organization and your kind of bio in a brief summary?
Sure. So Houston A+ Challenge has been around 20 years. It was formed to serve the purpose of improving public education here in Houston. And so we've had some success, we've had some challenges. And I came to the challenge in 2008. I became the executive director, and before that I was in the Houston Independent School District, and I wanted to see if you could improve schools from the outside versus inside. So that's why I came to the nonprofit world. But probably a couple of programs that we've been successful with over our 20 years is that we launched the first early college model with the Houston Community College in the state of Texas. It still exists. It's called Early College, or Challenge Early College. It's at the HCC campus on the West Loop. A lot of the coaching that goes on inside of schools and school districts really wasn't around until A+ Challenge came around in 1997. And then I guess last big success, we just launched a personalized learning lab school called A+ Up. And so we've got a pretty vibrant incubator going around creative educational ideas.
Those are some really big projects.
Big projects. So the nonprofit was seeded with $20 million of Annenberg money 20 years ago, and then it was matched by $20 million. So when my organization opened its doors in 1997, it had $40 million in the bank to do work. So over the last 20 years, we've probably given maybe $130 million. To public education projects.
Wow, that's great. Mm-hmm. So how many staff members do you oversee in the organization?
Yeah, so right now we have 20,
okay.
20 staff members, and they're divided into 3 segments. So we have staff that work on our convene strategy. Convene strategy basically is a series of events, a series of programs throughout the year of bringing the Houston public together in different types of form to discuss public education. The second segment is the incubator. That's where the personalized learning lab school spun out of. But the incubator is basically all of the innovative ideas that at one time we are working on. So just presently, one of the projects in the incubator is a project to take what we're learning about personalized learning and apply it to armed services veterans that have come out of the service, but they're having difficulty getting into college. And that's probably one of the reasons why they went in the service, is that they couldn't qualify for college, but now they really want to move forward to get at least an associate's degree. And so we're using what we learned in the personalized learning lab pilot to approach this work with the veterans. Boeing is funding the project, so we're really excited to get that started. And then the third segment, as we work to create new possibility in the public education space, morally and ethically, my board decided that we needed to still take care of existing schools. So a third segment of our staff works on what we call our strengthen strategy. And so right now, I think we're in 80 schools, coaching principals, coaching teachers to improve their practice.
Wow, that's really neat. That's a lot going on.
Thanks.
I like the incubator thing too. That's pretty cool.
It's pretty exciting. Houston doesn't really have an incubator for public education, so this is something that the board is committed to and really wants to see grow.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me a little bit of Google. Google has their arm that's like always experimenting and coming up with great things.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, that's great to be innovative.
Yeah, and if there's ever a sector that needed some innovation, it would be public education because, and I'm sure your audience is, going to know what I'm ready to say. But some of the structures in public education, in American public education, are 140 years old. Mm-hmm. And so when you go to other sectors, you don't really see things, 140 years old in those sectors. Mm-hmm. But you do in public education.
That's very true.
Yeah.
That's a great point. So what would you describe your leadership style as for your team right now?
Oh, I would say that my leadership style, when I was in the school district, and I was a middle school principal, I was very direct, very top down. But then I opened a high school, and the high school was about 3 times the size of the middle school. And it was that change in scale that caused me to realize that I was not going to be able to supervise all activities on a high school campus. So I had to facilitate, I had to delegate, and I really, what it came down to is I had to work through others. And then I became a region superintendent, and then I had 5 feeder patterns. I had about 60 schools. And so that need to delegate, became even more prominent. So when I came to the nonprofit, I was really ready to, lead a facilitative sort of flat organization, and I think we've done a pretty good job. So our org structure, if you looked at our org chart, we have an executive director, myself, and then we have 2 directors. And 1 director handles all of the Strengthen initiative, and then the other director handles the Convene and the Incubate. And then they have some staff, we call that, most of that staff coaches, and so they have coaches that work with them. But yeah, so when we have a staff meeting, there's 20 people in it, and it's not pretty easy. It's easy to communicate with all of those 20.
And so when you're looking to hire somebody, or if you have any sort of personnel issues, what are you really looking for in the people that work for you?
Oh, I'm looking for someone that probably between 70 to 80% of their time they know what needs to be done, and they know how to work on what needs to be done. So I had one of my board members share this. He works, or he has worked in public accounting. And the way that the accounting field has sort of set things up, and I think other industries have done this also, is you sort of have this worker level, and then you have sort of your manager level, and then you have your partner level. And the partners are sort of charged with doing about 20% of the work, but making about 80% of the decisions, right? The workers are charged about 80% of the work, 20% of the decisions. So that's kind of how I try to approach it. It's not that I can't work. I've been at that worker level, but now, you know, I've been in public education for 1984, so 33 years, and I think I'm more of a decision maker, more of a vision maker now than probably, you know, any other responsibility.
Wow. So you have been in the education field for a long time.
I have.
Can you?
Does that mean that you're calling me old?
No,
Oh, okay.
Experienced
Okay,
is what we like to
experience.
say.
Right.
So is there a time where you have failed as a leader that really sticks out to you, or was a growing moment?
Oh yeah. So there's probably been 3 or 4 times, you know, I thought I was going to get fired. You know, one had to do with I was the testing coordinator at a local high school. This is 20 years ago, and a bell went off during state testing, and so kids started to move to their next class. The only problem is they had test booklets, they had test answer sheets, they were carrying them around in the hallway. It was a big test violation, right? And the principal was in Japan at the time. So not only was I the testing coordinator, but I was in charge of the school. And I called my wife, you know, that night and said, you know, I think I'm going to get fired. That was a big failure, but you know, one of the things that, you know, I think everyone, you know, if you can survive failure, you're going to be smarter for it, right? And I think everybody is going to get into failing situations. You know, the key is survive it, learn from it, and then I think you'll be you'll be a better person and probably a better leader for it.
That's some good advice.
Yeah.
So this week's TED Talk that the students watched is around being a conductor, a good conductor,
Oh, okay.
and so like music, not trains.
Yeah.
And so looking at, like, part of the lessons were around enjoying the work you do and empowering those who are working for you and doing stuff without doing stuff. Do you have any bits of advice around leadership?
Well, I
in
have.
those areas?
The first thing is if the TED Talk was on conducting, I have a book that if folks want to do a bit more investigation around conducting and sort of transferring conducting into leading, the book is called The Art of Possibility. It's written by Ben Zander, Zander. He himself is a conductor, a musical conductor, but it is all about the conducting of possibility in one's personal and professional life. And it's an excellent read. I would really recommend it. I think conducting is a pretty appropriate analogy to the way, at least the way I lead. So there are certain times in the score, you know, we talk about being tight and being loose. You know, when the orchestra needs some conducting and when the orchestra doesn't need as much conducting. And so I think as a leader, one of the things that I try to do is I always try to sense where the organization is compared to where we want to take the organization. And if it's making good progress, then that's loose conducting. If things need to tighten up in order for that organization to make necessary steps toward you know, a desired direction, then that's when, you know, as the chief conductor, you have you have to tighten up.
That makes sense.
So it's that relationship between loose tight that I think good leaders have and poor leaders don't have.
Yeah, wow, that's some good advice too. One question that Dr. Sanborn always likes to ask is...
I'm not answering any questions that Bob Sanborn asks, so no, I'm just kidding.
Okay.
He just texted me he's in California.
He's in Napa.
Oh, okay.
I forgot to tell the class. He's in Napa.
Class. The next time Dr. Bob gets back, just remember, he missed class because he's drinking wine in Napa right now.
He did tell me he's the designated driver for the group,
Oh,
so that's kind of unfortunate.
Yeah.
But can you name 3 nonprofits in Houston that you think should be more effective than they currently are?
Oh, I think Houston has its share of some outstanding nonprofits. So I really like Collaborative for Children. Carol Shattuck leads that group. I think Brian Green at Houston Food Bank does good work. I would say are you going to count school operators as nonprofits?
Sure, I think there's
So I think there's a new nonprofit, and we basically launched it, but now it's spun out on its own. It's called A+ Unlimited Potential. It's a new brand of school. It's all around personalized learning. So I would say that those 3 would probably be good examples. 2 very established, very traditional, and then a new one on the landscape.
That's great. If you were writing a book on leadership, what would be your top couple chapters?
Oh, so when we launched the personalized learning lab school, we came up with this acronym around personalized learning, and it was GREAT. So the G stands for growth, the R stands for relationships, the E stands for empowerment, the A stands for anytime, anywhere learning, and the T stands for technology. So you could actually transfer those into sort of chapters around leadership, right? So are you growing as a leader? What do your relationships look like? Are you an empowered leader? Do you understand that you are leading anytime, anywhere? I'll tell you all kind of a funny story. My mom and dad live with us. My dad is 91. He just had his 91st birthday two days ago. Wow. And my mom is 88. Well, so my dad, he basically grew up thinking that people work from 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock. And so when he sees me on my phone and I'm texting or emailing or doing work on my iPhone, he'll say, "Son, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm working." And he doesn't understand that at all, right? Because in his generation, work was defined as 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock, right? But now it's sort of so how do you lead in a real-time world, right? Anytime, anywhere, right? Work is being done. And then I think another question is, are you a technological leader, right? But out of those 5 choices, without a doubt, what most of that book would be about is relationships.
We've had some other folks talk about that. Can you tell us a little bit about how important relationships are?
Well, so I referee basketball, and so I'll explain this through a story that deals with basketball refereeing. So one night there was a referee that he happened to be the president of a college of education, and he was at a banquet with the president of the university, and the waiter came around, served a steak and baked potato, and put 1 pat of butter on these two guys' baked potatoes. And the college dean turned to the president and he said, "We only got one pat of butter. You know, this guy clearly doesn't know who we are. I'm the dean of the College of Education. You're the president of the university." So they waved the guy back over. They said, "Hey," they said, "you know, I'm the dean of the college, and he's the president, and we want more pats of butter." And the waiter leans over and he goes, "You must not know who I am. I'm the guy who decides how many pats of butter you get, and you get one." And I tell that story a lot because what my friend and the college president were operating around was something called position power. What they should have operated around is something called personal power, right? So in order to get those extra pats of butter, it wasn't about pulling rank, right? And saying, you know, you're a lowly waiter, right? Give us the pats of butter because we are so high in this institution. So I tell that story a lot to new referees, and I also tell that to new educators, because I think we try to build relationships too much around position power. So you have to do this for me because I'm your boss. Or you have to do this for me, and this is kind of a sensitive topic right now, because I wear a badge. Good police officers, good bosses, all understand that it is all about relationship, right? Getting people energized to do what you want them to do is all built upon the relationship that you and they commit to and they work on.
That's a very important point. You've been in Houston for a really long time. How have you, and not to call you old, experienced?
I was going to say, you know, long time, veteran, experienced.
Well, how have you seen the landscape of Houston change in terms of your work and in terms of the nonprofit sector?
I think Houston's kind of stuck right now. I think Houston was 15 years ago, at least in the public education sector, we were seen as, if not a mover and shaker, the mover and shaker. We had two of the highest performing charter school systems in the country, KIPP and YES. We had a very innovative school district. The state itself was recognized for its work with the students of Texas. And I think what's happened is we've just kind of stayed in the space that we were around the turn of the century, and we haven't really made a move. Denver's moved in public education. Indianapolis has moved. New Orleans has moved. Houston, not so much. I think the other thing that I've seen in the nonprofit world is, at least in public education, we have two very different data sets floating in the public education world. Children at Risk would be a great example of a data set that basically tells some schools, you're not very good, right? You're a D or F school. Well, those D and F schools also have a different set of data to take a look at, and it comes from the state of Texas. And I don't know whether you know this, I don't know whether your viewers know this, but the last accountability rankings, I think it was about 99% of all schools in Texas were rated as meet standards.
I say that all the time, how ridiculous that is.
It's almost laughable, right?
Is.
That we're trying to convince someone, I don't know who we're trying to convince, that all of our schools are meeting standards for our kids.
When they're clearly not.
Yeah, so your audience Some of those folks probably have kids themselves, and they know those schools aren't meeting standards for their kids, right? So, like, I think that those are probably a couple of things that are going on, at least in the nonprofit, in the nonprofits that work with public education systems.
What do you think needs to happen to move Houston out of this rut?
Well, first we need to get honest with the data, and then I think we are ripe for a new iteration of public education offering. So 20 years ago it was something called KIP, right? And then YES, and then Harmony, right? But, I think our city, our state, our country confuses charters with innovation. So charters are nothing but sort of a legal vehicle to allow a group to step outside of the traditional public school, right? So like A+ Up is a charter, but A+ Up looks very different than KIP, right? So these kids are literally working on approaching learning standards, not through a standardized way, but through their own personalized way, right? So the example that we use is, so imagine if you had, a playlist on your iPhone, and I decided what the playlist was for everybody in the viewing audience. That's standardization, right? And like, we've convinced people, oh, y'all need to listen to the same playlist because we want everybody to learn the same thing, right? Well, like, there would be rebellion, right? I'm not listening to that. I don't like this. I don't, this doesn't speak to me. What most people want to do is, okay, tell me what you want me to learn, and then teach me how to go about building my own playlist to learn that. And I think, like, that's the next step. I think, where the KIPs and the YESs 20 years ago sort of did public school better than, HISD, I think we are on the cusp of like a learner-centric revolution, where learners aren't necessarily going to need educational institutions to tell them what they need to learn.
That sounds exciting.
It is exciting.
That kind of leads us to a question that one of our students, Andrea Kirkpatrick, asked, and it's, what are one of the most significant changes you've advocated for over your time at A+?
Oh, that's a really good question, Andrea. Well, so I would say one that I'm advocating for right now at the national level is it time that we do away with schools? Because I think there are examples from around the world that show us that kids can learn what we want them to learn, what we need them to learn, without going to a place that we've defined as school.
So how do you see that working? With more online programs, or?
Oh, I see it working all over the place, right? So I see community agencies, I see after-school providers, I see homeschoolers, I see private schools, I see some public schools will survive. What won't survive, in my opinion, is sort of this monopolistic feeling that a lot of school districts have. And like structures are all over the place, right? So the biggest structure is the compulsory attendance law, right? So one of the things that I wonder about is if tomorrow Texas abolished the compulsory attendance rule for kids, how many of them would show up to school the next day? How many of them would say, you know what, if I had a choice, and like they're not going to come after my mom and dad if I don't show up to school, right? I'm going to vote with my feet and say, no thanks, I'm not going back to that place anymore because that's not working for me. And it used to be when I started the career, when you said kids, there were places that weren't working for kids. People identified those kids as dropouts, right? Oh, they're dropping out because they're pregnant, or they're 2 years behind. Not the case anymore, right? I think we've got like A and B students that like are physically, if not emotionally, checking out of a place called school.
So you think that the compulsory attendance laws should be abolished? Is that what
I think there are some rules that have been established for public schools that have stacked the deck against other potential providers of learning. I'll give you an example. So we were looking for a site to host one of our charter operations, and we had the place, and we were ready to sign the deal, and lo and behold, we could not occupy classroom space in this. It's an institute of higher education here in Houston, because they didn't have an E-rated classroom. So E-rating stands for educational. Well, they're doing education. They're just doing education at a high, at the higher ed level. Well, we kind of looked into this, and maybe it was 50 years ago. All of the superintendents went to the city of Houston and basically got a monopoly on this E-classroom rating, right? So, like, the only folks that have E-rated classrooms, for the most part, are schools. So, like, even if, like, some of your viewers said, hey, I want to start a school, it would be hard to find places to host schooling because schools have sort of this monopoly on this E-rating. That's just one example, right?
Yeah, there seems to be a lot of.
You have to go to school 100, or now they've switched it to minutes. There's certain minutes that you have to go. That's ridiculous, right? That is like telling my kids. So I have 4 kids. That's like telling my kids, okay, you can only learn, for this number of minutes, and you can't learn anymore. Well, take a look at your audience. See when they learn.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and here's the deal: is they're probably multitasking right now around learning, right? So they're probably watching this. We hope. They might be reading. They might be, texting. They are rotating into, inside of their sort of their learning wheel.
Right. I just don't want our students to be confused about, there's a lot of research around chronic absenteeism and how it poorly affects their students' academic achievement, right? So I don't want our students watching to be confused about the time on task and all these other great
well,
statistics
I
you
mean, yeah. So they're your students, but like I think because I've noticed a lot of that research that's come out the last 6 months. Kids that go to school do better than kids that don't go to school. I would like to test that, and I would like to test kids that go to school. Do they actually do better for kids who don't go to school but continue their learning? And I think that's one of the mistakes that we've made is we think that you have to go to school to learn. We've committed a cardinal sin in making those synonymous. And anyone who has spent time in schools knows there is, I think we figured it up when I was in HISD. In the elementary day, I think the elementary day was 7 hours and 45 minutes. And after all of the bathroom breaks, after all the lunch, after all the recess, all of that, there was about 3 hours and 15 minutes of learning time. So there's a book out there called Leaving to Learn. It's written by the big picture learning guys, Elliot Washer, Charles Muchkowski, and they basically say that school has stunted learning for maybe not 100% of the kids, but for a greater percentage than what people who work in the system are willing to admit.
It is, like you said, a very old system that's been in place.
It's an archaic system. I was teaching a class one semester, and it was a graduate class, and I called 4 superintendents to play the role of a panel. And so the graduate students were like launching these softball questions to these superintendents. So I decided, okay, I'm going to give them a 90-mile-per-hour fastball, right? And this is the question that I asked them. I said, do any of you stay awake at night and lose sleep because you have figured out that you lead outdated, archaic systems? And I thought, sure, Shay, what they would do, what they would lie to me. Because who's publicly going to say, yeah, I lead a system that is archaic and outdated and irrelevant. But to a superintendent, every one of them said, I worry about that, right? And one superintendent said, you know what? We've got to change, right? Because I can't ask my people to work any harder. We can't go to school any longer, right? And I guess they could, expand into the summer. But in terms of current structure, but what's that old saying? Your system is perfectly designed right now to give you your current results. You want different results? You better change your system.
That's a great point. What do you think about the districts of innovation? For students who don't know what that is, it's a law that was passed in the last legislative session.
I think it's 1842.
Yeah. I think so. And school districts can basically throw away 80%, 85% of the really big education code and govern themselves.
Yeah, I think there's potential there. I'll tell you a quick story. I was talking to a district leader, and they're very excited about being a district of innovation. And their innovation is going to be, they're going to let kids choose what school they go to.
So the innovation could be minimal, or it could be...
Well, I would call the question, is that innovative?
Right.
Right? So the challenge is, can bureaucrats innovate? And I was in a bureaucracy for 23 years. There was not a lot of innovation inside of most HISD meetings, and I'm not picking on HISD. I think it's just the nature of the beast. And so when you ask schools and districts, well, why can't you innovate? If you ask schools, it's because of the district. If you ask districts, it's because of the state. If you ask the state, it's because of the feds, right? So all of them sort of have this, excuse wheel. And it is, I think probably the current public school system has, for about, I'd say 70% of the remaining market share, it might have about 50 years.
Wow. Well, it will be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, well, it's old, right? It's sort of like that, they ask a question, what's the only public institution that if Rip Van Winkle would come back today, he would recognize? It's the public school.
Yeah. That's a great point. Let's go back to some of these questions from students. Emily Schreiber asks, how has your organization adjusted its mission and or vision over time to evolve with changing needs?
Yeah, really good question, Emily. Just recently, we made what would appear to some people to be a subtle change, but like to us, it is a monumental change. So our mission is to serve as a catalyst for change and a model for innovation. And in the past, probably for the first 19 years, what followed those two terms, catalyst for change, model for innovation, was in public schools in the Houston, Texas region. And we have dropped schools and we have added schooling because we don't think, and I'm speaking for the board now, we don't think that the best schooling is necessarily going on in schools.
That's a great point. Do you see any of your other, you're on a couple other boards, correct?
I am.
So do you see any of the same kind of method, avenue of thinking happening anywhere else in education in Houston?
Yeah, so there's a guy named Mike Olson. He runs a group. I don't think it's a 501c3. I think it's a private. Well, this would be a question to you. Yeah, I guess he would be a 501c3. But it's a private schooling endeavor initiative. It's called Talent Unbound. And I think like Mike is probably farther out there with his thinking than we are. But I really like Mike. I appreciate Mike because we don't have enough Mikes thinking the way that they need to. So that would be probably it, I would say, for Houston. Now, nationally, there are others. So there's a neat group in Denver, Colorado called Reschool Colorado, and they're thinking along these same lines. Reschool, right? Not school, but we got to reschool, right? We got to rethink what we're doing, with this whole thing that we call school. So nationally, there's a group that we just came across last week. We were at a meeting, the Institute for Personalized Learning, out of a suburb in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So there's a little school district in California called the Lindsay Unified School District, 4,200 kids, almost totally K through 12 personalized learning, right? So this idea, that public school districts can't do this work, I don't think that's necessarily true,
Right. It seems
Pasadena ISD and Spring Branch are probably the two districts that we know of that are really rocking it right now in terms of producing self-directed learners, right? So for most of my career, my job was not to produce a self-directed learner. My job was to get a kid to pass a state test, right? And I think, given the last legislative session, there's been enough pushback that over the last 30 years that might not have worked as well for Texas as what folks thought it was going to.
Well, we have had a couple of students ask on the Twitter feed what you think about STAR tests and if it should be eliminated or changed.
Yeah, so I think assessment is necessary. I think the state being tight, here we go back to this conductor example. I think the state being tight with districts that you must exhibit assessments that we approve of. But this whole idea that one day we're going to administer this one test to every, child in Texas, that's very 20th century. And like one of my colleagues reminded me today, we are 1/5 into the 21st century.
Wow.
Right?
That's hard to believe.
Yeah. So let's get about what this could look like for kids in the 21st century and stop living in the 20th century.
That is a great idea. Let's try to work to get there. Let's see. We are just about out of time, so one fun question we like to ask is what's your favorite restaurant in Houston?
Well, I bet you get this answered before they arrive. There are so many good restaurants in Houston. We are partial to Pico's.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah.
That's a good place.
So I think Pico's probably has the best margarita. And I don't get like the specialty margaritas. I just get the regular grande, and it's tasty. But yeah, so Pico's, and I guess we're kind of attracted to Pico's because I think Arnaldo, who owns Pico's, opened in 1984. We moved to Houston in '84, so it's kind of generational for us.
That's great. Well, Pico's is currently on Kirby and
Richmond. And Arnaldo, if you're watching, you owe me a margarita for giving you a pitch.
Well, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Dr. Van Beck, and students, thank you for tuning in again and for all your wonderful questions. We look forward to doing this again next week. I think Dr. Bob he will be back. All right, thank you all so much.